thing in American history that some people still try to argue. There is no question that slavery is the cause of the Civil War. Is everybody clear on that?
Yes.
We can just go home, make slavery. We don't need this. You get an essay prompt on Civil War, slavery. One word, I'm done. Right? 9, whatever. Almost to 7. That's not going to happen, right? And the reason is because when we talk about causes of the Civil War, it would be more precise to say the consequences and repercussions of slavery and how that leads to war, right? Because we've been kicking the can of slavery down the road in America since 1619 at this point. Right? 1619, bring the first African slaves to Virginia, the same year as they formed the House of Burgesses. This is kind of a bitter irony there. And so during the colonial period, it was about the normalization and the codification of slavery, how it became a thing, how it became an American institution. Then we get to the time of the American Revolution, and they're like, can we really stage a revolution about, can we really put out a Declaration of Independence that says all men are created equal and continue to have slavery? Right? Jefferson himself wants to condemn slavery, a slave owner. The irony of that is a slave owner wants to condemn slavery in the Declaration of Independence. But John Adams and Ben Franklin, not themselves slave owners, say no. The issue is independence, not slavery. We'll deal with slavery later. We gotta be an independent country first. Then we'll fix that problem. So they kick the can down the road. We get to the Constitution. Right? Well, how is the Constitution going to deal with slavery? We got to get rid of slavery finally. And they say no. The issue is unity, not slavery. The nation has to be unified under one government. Then we'll worry about slavery later. So we kick the can down the road again. And we just kind of get in this habit of like, it's always hey, can we deal with slavery now? No, we've got that other issue. No, we've got that other issue. We got to do this and we got to do that. And it's constantly just kind of putting it off. But throughout the first half of the 1800s, what's really happening is that America is growing by leaps and bounds, and one of the significant contributors to that are the labor of people who are not paid. Right? Now let's just take the simple evil immorality of slavery off the table just for a second. You say to yourself, if you obviously an evil institution, take that off the table just for a second and think about what's happening in America during this time when we talk about the growth of the free market. A free market and slavery are simply incompatible because a free market capitalism requires that it's an essential requirement of that people who labor earn a wage so that they make money so that they can purchase products so that they can continue to keep the thing going, right? So you've got all these people doing all this work and never being compensated for it, and because they're not compensated for it, they cannot contribute to the growth of the economy. So by the 1850s, what's really happened is the rest of the country has long since abandoned slavery as an institution. The South, the cotton producing South, still clings to it because that labor source, and frankly, it's because all their money's tied up in it. Those Southern slave owners have all their money tied up in land, cotton, and slaves. And so they can't figure out a way to shut it off. So they keep telling themselves, we have to perpetuate this, we have to keep doing this. And the rest of the country is like, man, come on. Are you kidding me? We're moving west. We're building big cities. They'd already started laying the plans for a transcontinental railroad. The country is modernizing, and we're becoming this. You can see the beginnings of America's economic dominance that will happen at the turn of the 20th century, and slavery becomes a huge economic impediment to that. So that's a major component of that. The issues of tied to cotton. Cotton is a labor-intensive crop then and now, right? And so people are like, well, how do we do this, sort of thing. The whole Southern economy is not diversified, right? It's all about cotton. So you take that off the table, and they don't really have any other means of economic viability. Right? By the time of the American Civil War, America is the largest producer of cotton in the world, and that's sort of this. It's our number one export, and so the whole country, unless you think it's just the South that is just tied into this, right? The South is where slavery happens, but the whole country is tied to it economically because they produce all that cotton in the South, but it's refined into textiles in the North. So there are people who have never seen a slave or owned a slave who are benefiting from this evil institution. So the whole system, if you're going to be honest about it, has blood on its hands because of that. It is the great shame of all of America, not just the South. All of it's tied to this. King Cotton ruled by this thing. People who were abolitionists like that start referring to King Cotton, like we were a free people until we were taken over by this monarch that is Cotton. That's kind of how they think of it. It's like in this sort of thing. Now, while that's happening, for a long time, people kind of start making the logical argument, like I just did, that slavery is economically not practical, and it's like whatever. There's all these economic models and blah 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 blah, right? In the 1840s, what really kind of starts to happen is people had started to do that, and sometimes when you make that logical argument, you forget the human equation. So abolitionists, starting in the 1840s, they start to say things. They start to put out this radical idea. Never mind all that crap. You know, all that stuff I just said. Never mind that. It's just evil and immoral. And if there is a judgment day, we're going to have to answer for it. For the evil, absurd notion that one human being can own another one. And all the things that are tied into that. The most famous example of these abolitionists who really put this out in really stark terms is Harriet Beecher Stowe in the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. She publishes it in 1852, a few years before the Civil War breaks out. And in this novel, it's not a good book. I don't recommend it. Read it in excerpt. We read pieces of it. Because she's not a great novelist. But the parts of it where it really stand out is where she really just talks about slavery in simple, stark terms. And she starts talking about aspects of slavery that nobody else had ever talked about, like slavery for women. That women are sold, not only for labor like men, but are sold for sexual objectification. Be sold down there, like is that the society? I mean, it's tied to, we just say slavery is like, but it justifies if slaves aren't people, then killing one is not murder, right? And forcing yourself on a slave woman is not rape. But she goes, but in fact, it really is. It legalizes rape and murder and the worst examples of human behavior. And if you do not see that, it's because you are not looking. And people are like, whatever. That novel is so influential. It's the first bestseller, right? In terms of American fiction. It's so influential that when 10 years later she goes to the White House and she meets President Lincoln, Civil War's been going on for a year or two. He says, "Oh, so you're the little lady who started this war," right? Because he refocuses like this is evil, and there are lots of people who sign up to fight in the Union Army to put on the blue, black and white, because they read that book and say, you know what, I'm going to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. For a lot of people, that's what it's about. It's not what it's about for Lincoln at first. He's about preserving the Union. He'll come to that later. So there's this sort of thing. Now, of course, all that's happening, and these southern states, how people would do people are doing something wrong, and everybody starts telling them how wrong they are, and then they kind of get like, well, y'all are against me. Well, on some level, this is wrong. And so this siege mentality is exactly that. People who, on some rational level, know that what they're doing is wrong. That they're perpetuating evil, but then everybody keeps telling them. They feel like everybody's piling on them. Like, well, you said it was evil. You said it was evil. Everybody's against us. All these abolitionists and the government and the new Republican Party. The Republican Party is formed in 1854. Free men, free markets, free soil. Right? We want to move west. We're going to move. We're a pro-growth, pro-expansionist, pro-business, pro-freedom party. We're not. That's a ludicrous system. We're moving past this. And they say, see, all these people are against us, right? That siege mentality. We're under siege by all these other social forces. Y'all don't respect our history, our culture, our heritage, or whatever, and you got all your fancy new stuff, but what about our stuff? The South won't modernize, and so then when the rest of the country modernizes, and they see all the benefits that come with that, new technologies and better standards of living, then the South will see everybody else is treating us like second class. Well, dude, you have to participate in this new world if you're going to benefit from it, and they don't want to. So it's a real complicated sort of thing. Now, tied to this, and I'm jumping around a little bit. I'm hitting some of these big pieces. Right, tied to this is the issue of tariff. right? Tariffs are taxes on imports and exports. And our chief export was cotton, so there's a big tariff on that. So then the South would say, well, see, then this tariff, we're the one that gets penalized on, on these tariffs. It's not the North. Like, yeah, because the North has diversified its economy, and so has the West. And they're not exporting. They've tied their whole economy to this one crop. So it's like making a really crappy choice, and then when everybody around you doesn't tell you what a great choice it is, you get pissed off. It's really, and I'm saying that I'm saying that as a Southerner, right? It's hard for me to wrap my brain around. Those are my ancestors somewhere along back there. Like it's stupid. There's no common sense to it. To this sort of thing. But people get something in their head, and it can be a real dangerous sort of thing, right? The rest, the proof, if you want, that the rest of the country is moving on from slavery, if you need historical evidence of that, is tied closely to this notion of manifest destiny, right? That westward expansion, that God's will was manifest, and that America was meant to be a nation from sea to shining sea, as long as we're willing to kill the people who already live there and take their stuff, right? While that's happening, when we move into these new places, when new territory comes into the Union, nobody ever really wants to expand slavery into it, for the most part. Like, well, we're going to move west. Texas will join because we were a slave republic, slave-owning republic. So when they become a state in 1845, that's an exception to that. But for the most part, every time we get new territory, we get all that territory after the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, which most of what is now California and New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, places like that. Slavery doesn't go in any of those places, right? Cotton isn't commercially viable anyway, but the culture of the people who are there, who are mostly Latino, all these new Americans all of a sudden, who were Mexican citizens. Mexico outlawed slavery, right? And it had been declared a mortal sin by the Roman Catholic Church, and most of those people were Roman Catholic at that time. So culturally, it's never going to go there. And so then the South says, well, see, nobody wants to let us have slavery anywhere. Like, no, nobody wants. You don't get to impose your way on everybody else. And so the whole rest of the country has basically decided that they're just not really going to do slavery, and it'll eventually die out. Eventually the South will have to modernize, and no new slavery kind of becomes the thing that people are going to do, right? It holds back the economy. Well, that will start to change in the early 1850s, this idea of no new slavery, with the exception of Texas, right? Will start to change in the early 1850s with the settling of the Missouri Territory, right? Now, we'd had this Missouri Compromise back in 1820, where Missouri joins the Union as a slave state, Maine joins as a free state, but that Missouri Territory is a nebulous sort of a thing. And what really kind of starts to happen, the Missouri Territory ultimately becomes Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska. So it's a big chunk of the Midwest. So as Kansas said, people are moving into that area. And sort of settling that. The question is, well, if they move there with their slaves, do they still own those slaves? Because we said the Missouri Compromise set a certain geographical line, no new slavery. We're going to do this. So the idea was that people kind of start settling in, and they decide on this. They settle on this thing. And on your paper, we talk here about about this notion of popular sovereignty, right? Under the Compromise of 1850, right? We're not gonna do this sort of thing anymore. But but Congress doesn't know what to do about slavery, and the presidents don't know what to do about Congress or about slavery. Nobody knows what to do. So they said, we'll just let the people decide. So as new territories organize, what'll happen is that when they get to be enough that they can petition for statehood, they'll vote, they'll create a state constitution, and they'll decide if they want to be a slave state or a free state. So the thought is that New Mexico, places like this, they'll organize under this, no problem, right? It's overwhelmingly free state vote. Nobody really wants to do slavery there. So what some southern states started to think about is like, well, if Kansas were to become a state, that land would be very lucrative. It'd be great for growing cotton because it's great farmland. But we have to have some Southerners there if they're ever going to get a chance of voting in slavery. So they start a land rush into Kansas out of Missouri and some other southern states. they start going into Kansas, and then abolitionists start settling free soilers into Kansas as well. So the thought is, we'll get a bunch of people, then we'll have the vote, and you basically populate Kansas with people who see the world the way you want it to be. Right? When they get there, this the free state people and the slave state people start butting heads like you would expect, and they start shooting at each other by 1854. You have full-blown civil war in Kansas by 1854. Right? There's basically this basic notion of popular sovereignty is going to has the unintended consequence of people. Well, if I shoot you, you can't vote. Right? So I want to have a free state, so I shoot all the slave owners, and then we'll have a free state. Problem solved, right? Not really the high-minded intention of democracy, right there, exactly. And so this is kind of what they try to do. And you see both sides, like just really vicious fighting, like you call it outright murder, and it's total war, men, women, children. It's a real mess. Of these things, and it's going on for 5 or 6 years before the war ever breaks out anyplace else, right? So coming into the 1850s, you've got Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. You've got open warfare in Kansas. You got people just really willing to kill each other over slavery, and are doing so already. Now, then in 1854, a major new political party emerges on the scene when the Republican Party is formed. And there have been all these other political parties, but there have really only been the Democrats as a big party for a long time. All right? And so now the Republicans emerge, and that's how we get the two modern political parties. We've had the same two since the 1850s now. Right? And so the Republicans come along, and they run a candidate for president in 1856 named John Fremont. He doesn't go very far. But by 1860, that party's really grown, and they get a guy named Abraham Lincoln to be their presidential candidate. Of course, we know how well that works out because he's on money and Mount Rushmore and got a big monument, maybe next to George Washington, the most important president in American history. Right? So Abraham Lincoln becomes the first Republican president. Now, the Republicans are an anti-slavery party. Right? Lincoln himself says on the slavery issue, I'm about preservation of the Union. Right? Preservation of the Union. So Lincoln doesn't come to this great this moral reason for getting rid of slavery until later into the war after Gettysburg. We'll talk about that on next Tuesday. But the idea that, it doesn't matter how many times Lincoln says, I'm for preservation of the Union. And Lincoln famously says, if that means slavery or no slavery or some compromise in between those two things, whatever. Preserve the Union, but no matter how many times he says that, the South is still convinced that Lincoln is an abolitionist and whatever. And they say, if this country elects Abraham Lincoln president, we will secede from the Union. We're done. It'll mean civil war, right? So of course the election of 1860 rolls around and he does win, And so you've had all these other things. This very contentious period, and so Lincoln wins the election in November of 1860. South Carolina ruins Christmas that year by being the first state to secede from the Union. America's whoopee cushion, South Carolina. Crazy stuff always starts there, right? And so South Carolina secedes from the Union. Before Lincoln even takes office, 6 other states will go, including Texas. The first 7 will go. He'll be inaugurated in March. Then 4 others will go. Ultimately, 11 states will attempt to secede from the Union. And then, of course, Lincoln's in a situation where, the President of the United States can't let people take territory and leave the United States. Right? It's a challenge to America's sovereignty, and he responds in the only way that he can, I guess, from his way of thinking, is with force. And then you're down to it. And we'll talk about the war, the war and Reconstruction. We'll talk about next Tuesday. Did I go too fast through that? Is there pieces that this doesn't make? We try to lay this out. This is not not all of this is chronological, but the numbered causes. These are long-term causes. I like that we break. This is a good sheet. We broke this down. The long-term causes and then the immediate lead-up in the 1850s. Everything just gets crazy in the 1850s. It's going to go poorly. Questions? Okay, know the names of those acts and stuff. You'll get questions on Missouri and Kansas, Nebraska, and all that. Okay, if you have any individual questions, you can hang around and ask.